Welcome back to the KDPG Sunday Edition. I'm John Delano. Let's get back to talking with our guest, Democratic Congressman Mike Doyle. I'm joined alongside by Post-Gazette political reporter Julian Routh. Mike, 2020, what a key, important election. I mean, we always say it's the most important election in our lifetime. Is 2020 going to shape up to be just that election?
I can't imagine any election that has bigger ramifications for the future of the country than this one, and the fact that Pennsylvania, and more specifically Western Pennsylvania, is probably going to play a rather large role in not only who wins the state, but who maybe has the electoral votes to be president. So we're going to see a lot of candidates and a lot of action in our neck of the woods.
Well, let's focus on the presidential election. I do want to ask you about some of the others if we have time, but the presidential election, first, our primary, which is not until April 28. Does that mean that Democrats in Pennsylvania really won't have much to say about who the nominee is going to be for the Democratic Party? Or might there be a closer vote and maybe we become a decider?
It's going to be interesting when you think about Super Tuesday is March 3rd, I want to say. By that time, 20 states will vote that day, and prior to that, 4 states will vote prior to Super Tuesday. So about half the country will have cast their votes by March 3rd. As you correctly state, our primary is not till the end of April. You know, this is a little different. There's several candidates that have staying power because they've raised so much money. And then you add to that 2 self-funders, Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg, that have the ability to stay in the race as long as they desire to stay in the race, along with the front runners. There's a possibility that come April 28th, we could still have a few candidates in this race. Could even go to the convention, which would be something we haven't seen in a long, long time.
So what you're suggesting is that if there is more of a deadlock in those early states, then Pennsylvania voters by the end of April might actually have 2 or 3 or 4 candidates to choose from. No one candidate will have a majority of the delegates at the convention by April 28th. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, that's a possibility. I'm just saying that you know, a lot of times when you see people drop out of the race, what happens is they're not doing well polling-wise, their resources dry up, and they're not able to go on. We have a situation where when you look at what Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg, and then you add Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer, these are people that still have substantial sums of money in their campaign funds and the ability to go through many more primaries than the first ones we're looking at.
Have you endorsed a candidate yet?
I have not. I'd like to see that list get down to a couple. I think after Super Tuesday, come March 3rd, I think we're going to have a much better handle on who the finalists are.
Is that you're going to wait until after March 3rd?
I might wait longer than March 3rd. I'm not. I know this: whoever our nominee is, I'm for. And I'll be working for it.
And just one little, I know this may be inside baseball, but superdelegates. There was a lot of criticism of the superdelegates back in 2016 in the race, Democratic primary race between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. You were a superdelegate. This year, superdelegates don't get to vote on the first ballot.
First ballot only, yes.
So you won't have a vote until the second ballot, if it goes to a second ballot.
Yeah, sort of a complaint of the Bernie folks back then. In reality, superdelegates have never determined the nominee of our party. So, you know, the fact that we're not going to be there on the first ballot, I don't think is going to make much of a difference. I think the whole idea behind superdelegates, by the way, was so they wouldn't run and make it impossible for other people who aren't as well known to be delegates to the national convention.
Right.
There's nothing stopping all of us from filing to run as a delegate that can vote.
Are you going to do that?
No, I'm not going to do that. But I'm just saying that was really the intent during the superdelegates, was to take the party leadership, people that, you know, have influence in the party, and you know, this is what they do. They know a little bit about the political process to help shape it. But there's never been enough votes to you know, put one candidate through over the other. But we'll see how this works this time.
Though you haven't yet endorsed a candidate, what are you looking to hear from the ideal nominee, and are you hearing it yet from anybody?
I think ideally what the American people are looking for, and what I'm looking for, ways that helps to unite the country. This is a very divided country right now, and it's not healthy for the country, and it's not a good situation in terms of getting things done. The tough issues, climate change, health care, these are issues that take bipartisan leadership to get done. So I'm hoping we hear from a candidate that wants to unite the party. I think someone that speaks to the economy and how we move forward in this 21st century, how we make sure people don't get left behind. I think that's a concern too. A lot of people look at, artificial intelligence and these autonomous vehicles, and they're saying, where do I fit in this 21st century economy? And I think education is going to be a big piece of that. So I want to hear a president that talks about how we make sure people are prepared for that. Climate change is huge, especially with young voters. They look at their future and say, what's the planet going to look like? And we need somebody who can unite people because to get that done is going to be very tough if we're not able to do that. And student loan debt, too, is another issue I think that millennials care deeply about. And John, if you think about it, I don't want to age you and I, but college cost a lot less when we went to college. And I'm a father that has 4 grandchildren, and I know what those costs are, and those student loan debt is really hurting young people, and we need to deal with that.
Congressman, you know as well as I that Donald Trump carried every county in western Pennsylvania except Allegheny County in 2016. Why won't he do that again?
Well, that really doesn't matter. Pennsylvania is an unusual county. The old formula, John, basically was win Allegheny County by close to 100,000, win Philadelphia County by 400,000, and the rest of the state can't catch you.
Well, that didn't work in 2016.
It didn't work in 2016 because, you know what, we didn't do well in towns that we still won: Erie, Scranton, Harrisburg, little towns that quite frankly the Clinton campaign didn't visit and didn't campaign in. We need a presidential candidate that's going to campaign in all those towns, and if we can keep the kind of margins in Allegheny and Philly that I think we will, and make sure that we're also paying attention to the smaller Democratic communities throughout Pennsylvania, I feel very confident that we can win the state.
Is there a key demographic group that you think the Democratic nominee must appeal to in order to win?
I think we need to appeal to all of them. I mean, we're a diverse party. There's a lot of energy amongst millennials. I think we need to address those kinds of issues. That's why I talked about climate change and student loan debt. That's important to millennials. But we also have to address people who have this fear of the future economy and where they fit in, this economic anxiety that they feel right now. A lot of people are approaching retirement age too with not much money in the bank, and that's a concern too. How do they make sure that their retirement savings, that they don't outlive them? These are all issues, and I don't think we can ignore any group this election. We need to be speaking to all of them.
Besides the huge election we face, 2020 also marks the beginning of a new decade. What do you think when you look back in the history books in 100 years, you're going to read about the 2010s? Describe what that meant for the political atmosphere in this country.
Well, I think about Pittsburgh and have watched this remarkable transformation we've gone through. But we've gone through a political transformation too. A lot of times there's always been a talk, and can we survive as a two-party system in this country? And in spite of all the division that we see in the country today, we're still pretty much a two-party system in America. Although I've never seen the parties quite this divided. And I think part of that is due to the changes we've seen in the way people get news. The internet and social media has really changed the political landscapes in the country. When I first got elected, there was no Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. Now people, they get information out of a fire hydrant, a lot of it without filters. And I think it's changed the political discourse, and it changed the way we interact with one another.
Are you feeling good about 2020?
Yeah, I feel good about 2020. I just think we're going to see a huge turnout, and that's healthy. I think the bigger the turnout, the more you can accept the results. My hope is that we field a candidate that wants to unite the country, not keep it divided. And I think that message will trump division, no pun intended, and that we'll get a result that I think will be good for the country.
Well, Congressman Mike Doyle, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
John.
I want everyone to know that we also invited Congressman Guy Reschenthaler, Republican, a very strong supporter of President Trump. He wasn't able to make it today, but we'll have him on for the Republican side of all this coming up. And we'll be back in a moment when the KDPG Sunday edition continues. Stick with us.